Her work focuses on forest ecology and the use of archeological samples to understand forest history. And thanks for coming, and I'll turn it over to Dr. de Graauw.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McEwen. I'm excited to talk about the research that I've been working on for a while with all of you. I admittedly sort of changed things up a little bit at the last minute, so I apologize. My talk title is still pretty much on trend for what I'm going to talk about, but the content has changed ever so slightly. So I guess really the theme of this talk is about the research that I've worked on in the last 6 years, and that is using historic log buildings and the tree rings within those buildings to inform our understanding of past forest ecology. So that's the general theme. The title of my talk, All the Forest in a Barn, sort of came about when an article came out about my research back in October. This was in Blue Ridge Country magazine. And the journalist who wrote the article titled it All the Forest in the Barn, which I thought was a fairly clever title for a talk or for a magazine article. But at the same time, you know, it's not quite right when we think about tree ring data from historic log buildings or from a barn in the case of this journal article. It doesn't quite represent all the forest. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today. But nevertheless, I thought it was a really interesting story that she did. And as a journalist, sometimes their stories fall flat, but this one was pretty cool. And she wrote, you know, each line from a log's revealed rings tells about the tree's birth and life before it was cut and placed in the barn. It's like looking at ghostly fingerprints. Those aren't my words. I didn't come up with that. That was the journalist, but I thought it was pretty exceptional. So I wanted to share that here. So going back then to the talk, the real question is, can we use tree ring data from historic log buildings to understand past forests? Or is all of a forest really represented in a barn? So that'll be the focus here. I wanted to just take a moment to pause, and this isn't something I normally do, but I wanted to dedicate this talk to my good friend, John Adamson, who passed away very suddenly a few weeks ago. He was a self-professed barn nerd. But more importantly, John thought it was really important to understand and to share the history of North America, including some of the darker bits that some people like to gloss over or sweep under the rug. And so that sort of in that spirit, I want to talk about some things that are a little bit hard to talk about in this talk. So just warning everyone here, but I think it's important that they get addressed often because otherwise we're not really doing any service to North American history. So this one's for you, John. I want to start talking first about the enduring romanticism of the primeval forest, part one, the vast wilderness of Eastern North America. You may or may not have heard the story or the myth or the legend about the forests of Eastern North America around the time of colonization were so dense and thick that a squirrel could jump from tree to tree all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. And if you haven't heard it, I guess you've heard it now. And I don't mean to continue to perpetuate that, but it's out there. And you probably didn't expect to see art today, but here we are looking at art. So these are some Romanticism period pieces of art from about the 1700s and 1800s. Romanticism was really popular in the art world. And the ones that I'm showing you today are specifically art pieces that are landscapes of North America, focusing on Eastern North America. So this is one by Asher Brown Durand that is in, I believe this one was Massachusetts. So just take a moment to look at these scenes of art and think the things that, you know, feel the feelings that they invoke while you look at them. Here's another one. This one is a scenic vista view of Pennsylvania. This one's by Thomas Moran, done in 1868. A really nice view looking over a mountain valley with all of the trees and the beautiful vista. Here's another one, done by Asher Brown Durand in 1866. Another pretty vista view of mountains and forests and trees. This is probably one of my favorites. It might seem like I'm picking on Asher Brown Durand, but I actually do appreciate the art that he made in a certain sense. And then finally, here's another one. This one's called In the Woods by Asher Brown Durand. This was done in 1855. So this sort of invokes maybe a different feeling for you. The other ones are really pretty vistas. This one's a little bit more dark. You feel like you're submerged in this forest that's very dense. And now I'm going to talk about part 2 of the enduring romanticism of the primeval forest. And part 2 is big old trees, or big old trees, depending on where you're from. Here's some photos. These are from Tummel on the Mountains. This is a book that came out in 1964, written by Clarkson. It really documents the history of logging in West Virginia. So these 2 photos are both showing white oak trees. The first says this white oak tree was probably the largest tree cut by lumbermen in West Virginia. The other one, the king of the forest, a huge white oak with a notch for felling. There are a lot of other historical photos out there that show these old growth forests. This is a spruce forest that's also in West Virginia. This photo looks like it was taken in 1912. Here we have some chestnut trees in Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest. This is located in North Carolina. This picture is courtesy of the American Chestnut Foundation. So you can really see just the monstrous size of these chestnut trees, which of course we know now are basically functionally extinct on the landscape. They're still out there, but we don't see them in the numbers or in the size classes that we used to see them in. Here's another one, just showing folks taking pictures with big trees, so more historic evidence of the big trees of Eastern North America. People love taking pictures with big trees. So my question for you is, was Eastern North America a vast, untamed wilderness full of massive trees? This is a question that's going to come up a few times throughout this talk. But before we get into that, I want to first talk to you about my background. I love trees. I'm a tree hugger, as you can see in the picture there. But more importantly, my background has led me and prepared me to address questions like this. So it started with DendroEcology. I am certainly a tree ring person through and through. All of my background research has been in dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating or the science of tree rings. But my work started pretty innocently in Indiana. I was looking at gap phase dynamics in a small remnant forest in Indiana as an undergraduate student, and that really just drove my passion for tree ring science. That led me to do my master's research also in Indiana. The school was in Indiana, but my research was in California, or actually all of Western North America. And I was looking at the relationship between Pandora moth and its host tree, Ponderosa pine, and looking at that relationship between this defoliator and its host tree over the last 600 years or so, and how that's changed and how climate has affected that. That then led me to the work that I did in Mongolia as a PhD student. I was part of a team of people. We were working on an internationally recognized project documenting changes in precipitation, specifically focusing on the reign of Genghis Khan and how that affected his impact to rule a large portion of Asia during that particular time period. But at the same time, I was also dabbling in what's known as dendroarcheology. This is the tree ring dating of historic buildings. The first time that I ever did this, it just felt like I was working on a puzzle. So if you were present for Dr. Rockner's talk a few weeks ago, she talked about the principles of dendrochronology. And one of the overarching principles is this idea of cross dating, that we can match patterns of ring widths so that we can assign calendar dates to tree ring series. And this is really critical to dendroarcheology because you're essentially given this floating tree ring pattern and you don't know where it locks into time, and the whole goal is to figure out where in time that locks in so that you can tell people when their buildings were built. And I'm the kind of person that can't put down a puzzle once I start it. So as a tree ring scientist and from that perspective, it was really fascinating to me to be able to do that and to also tell people how old their buildings were. But what I started to notice as I was progressing through my research as a dendrochronologist was that all of my publications were coming out of my work as a dendroarchaeologist, so my hobby, and no publications were coming out of my research as a dendroecologist. And I thought, well, this is kind of problematic. So I found myself at this crossroads wondering, what am I going to do? Am I not a dendroecologist anymore, even though these things really matter to me, thinking about forest ecology? But I also didn't want to give up, the fun that I was having with dendroarchaeology. And so one day I found myself facing what's known as the Mill Point Barn in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. And I really had a pivotal moment here at this barn. So it's not much to look at from the outside. It's just very old looking. But if you walk inside, this is a historic log barn. And when we're talking about log buildings, when we refer to the rooms, so a room with 4 walls, we call those pens. So if you could imagine just a normal size room in a house, we would call that a pen in a log barn. And this particular log barn had 8 pens, which is incredibly unusual in size, very large. And each of those 8 pens was 2 stories high. And I estimated that there were about 300 or so logs in this building. And I'm sorry I don't have pictures. It was too big to take a picture of on the inside. But I was standing in this barn, and for the first time ever that I've ever stood in a building, I really felt like I was standing in a forest. It was that critical moment of, wow, this really does kind of represent a forest. And so that jump-started my research, which was combining dendrochronology, ecology, and archaeology and history into a primary focus. Instead of thinking of those 2 things very separately, I started to think about them together and wondering what I could do with these data. And this is actually now known as DendroArchaeoecology. I did not come up with that name. There are a few other researchers who are doing this type of work too, but it is a very new subfield of dendrochronology. It really got started around 2017, so like hot off the press new. And there are several of us out there who are asking questions about, what kind of data are historic log buildings holding, and how can we use those data? Because it's never really been done before. We've not investigated their use. So my first big question for my research and for my dissertation was, can historic log buildings inform our understanding of past forest ecology? And my particular study area was in the Central Appalachian region, so along the Ridge and Valley area of West Virginia and Virginia. And I started sampling as many buildings as I could get my hands on. And fortunately for that particular area, there are a lot of historic log buildings. So I had many to choose from, and a lot of excited landowners who wanted to know how old their buildings were. So sort of a win-win situation. So the very first question I had to ask myself was, are these buildings representative of past forests? And so I want to talk to you briefly about what it is that I learned in doing this research. The main thing that I learned is that there is a ton of human bias that's related to historic log buildings. So we have to imagine these buildings were constructed by European immigrants who came to North America. They had to clear a plot of land. They had to fell the trees to build their buildings. And so there are a lot of decisions that they were making that ultimately are controlling what kind of data are in historic log buildings. And so the main things that I recognized in looking into this were that there were specific site types, tree species, and tree sizes that I was going to find in these buildings that were very much related to the people who constructed them. So I'm going to go through those one at a time. Starting with species. So the real question I'm asking here is, what are the dominant species that we find in historic log buildings? I'm going to put HLB for short because this word comes up a lot, just so everyone knows. What I found in my particular study area is that the majority of species in the buildings were white oak, white pine, tulip poplar, and American chestnut. Now, these are all well within their ranges in my particular study area in the Appalachian region. Something of interest to note is that I did see a shift in the species that were used as we move through time, which might be indicative of changing availability of resources as more and more people, more and more European immigrants came into this area. The next thing I looked at was size. So how big are these logs? If you look at this picture that I have, and I were to ask you, are these logs all the same size? You might, guesstimate that they look pretty similar. To me, they look like they're all pretty similar in size. And so the question is, were logs selected from the forest based on their size? Were people going out and looking for a specific size tree to fell to build their buildings? And what I found was that the mean log diameter from all of the buildings that I worked on in the Central Appalachian region was about 28.6 centimeters. That's at the basal end. So if you're looking at a tree, we have to think about these logs in terms of trees. The basal end is at the bottom, the distal end is at the top. So I measured the basal end. And if we compare that by species, we start to see that there's a little bit of variability there in sizes. White oak is the species that I had the most samples from. So the variability there is pretty tight. I would say there's not much variability actually. And the mean diameter was 27.5 centimeters for those. White pine and tulip poplar were the largest trees that I was finding in these buildings, with quite a bit of, variability. And thinking about, were logs selected from the forest based on size? I think the answer is sort of. This is like kind of a hard one to get at with data. But it seems like people were trying to find logs that were not too small, because if they're really small logs, that takes more effort to construct a building. You have to get more logs just to make the building. And they couldn't be too large, because we have to think about technological advances at that particular time. They didn't have, the big cat machine to lift up the logs. This was all done by manual labor. So it couldn't be too big that it was too difficult to carry. So there's sort of this Goldilocks effect going on, not too small, not too large, and that's not very scientific. But the data do show that there are some differences, but generally speaking, we're not talking about a big difference in log diameter here. There were a few notable exceptions to this. So here's a picture of me holding up a core sample that I collected from this particular log. That core sample is about 12 inches long. And if you compare that with the size of the log, you can see that I didn't even get close to reaching pith or the center of the tree with that sample. So that one was really a monster, but that was certainly an outlier as far as sizes go. That log is basically taking up the space that 2 logs would normally take up in a building. So that is, and I think that's tulip poplar, if I remember correctly. So they were out there, but they certainly weren't common to see these really big logs. The other thing that really stood out to me looking at log sizes is that actually one of the smallest logs that I found in these buildings is American chestnut. It's kind of interesting to think about when you think back on those photos of American chestnut trees that I showed you earlier. We think about them as really big, monstrous trees, but in reality, we also see them as small individuals too. That can be forgotten sometimes, I think. And so the question that I'm actually asking when I ask, were logs selected from the forest based on size, is really, are logs all the same age, right? Because there's a relationship between tree size and tree age, and that relationship is not super strong, I would argue at least. So we can see here the spread of diameters of trees and the ages of trees, and this is from all of the logs. I'm going to use logs and trees interchangeably, just FYI. All of the trees that I sampled in this study. And you can see that, yes, there is a positive relationship between diameter and age. So as trees get older, they get bigger. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all big trees are old and that all old trees have to be big, right? So we can have small trees that are old, we can have big trees that are young. I want to point out 2 outliers here in my data for you just to demonstrate this point. The first one is a tree that's about 90 years old, and it happened to be the largest tree that I sampled in these buildings, so 40 centimeters in diameter, the absolute largest, and it was only 90 years old. The other one I'd like to point out is another tree that was about 175, 180 years old, and it was among the smaller trees that I sampled, so right around 23 centimeters in diameter. So there's definitely outliers here, there's definitely variability, but generally speaking, we do see that trees get larger as they get older. Now, thinking about this in relation to those pictures that I showed you earlier, this building here, this is a cabin that I sampled that was composed of quite a few American chestnut logs. And so we're seeing essentially American chestnut trees that are from the same period. And what we're seeing are 2 very different things. We're seeing these massive American chestnut trees with the folks who are posing by them. And then we're seeing American chestnut trees that are what I would call maybe more normal sized trees, not so massive, that are being used in these buildings. So something to reflect on, that we do have these 2 very different depictions of past forests here. The next thing I looked at was sites. So where were these log buildings constructed? Where were people constructing these buildings? And I apologize, this So Okay, and so most log buildings are found in valleys. And as we move through time, again, speaking specifically to the Central Appalachian region, I started to see more buildings being constructed in the mountains. And now I don't mean mountains like on top of a mountain. What I really mean here is that more people are building their buildings in small mountain valleys, what folks in West Virginia would call hollers. And so this is really representative of the idea of the settlement nucleus expanding, excuse me. So more and more people moving into an area, and folks are having to find places to build their homes further and further away from the most ideal locations. But generally speaking, broad river valleys are the places where these historic log buildings are located. And over time, we start to see a shift more towards smaller, more narrow mountain type valleys. I can summarize this and say that people were building these buildings in flat, fertile valleys that were near water sources. That was sort of the general theme. And this is another Romanticism era painting by Thomas Cole showing a home site where this person has felled trees to build their house. And it does a pretty decent job of depicting, what this might have looked like as soon as somebody came into an area and started constructing their homestead site and felling the trees. And they've got their house and their barn there as well. So revisiting this question then, is all of the forest represented in a barn? What I found in my first chapter of my dissertation, which was my first real, look into historic log buildings as ecological archives, is that no, there was certainly a specific interest in a certain type of species or certain species for construction, certain sizes of trees, and even certain site types. So that human bias is inherent there. We're not seeing species that were not dominant in forests. I'm not seeing really large trees, except for a few exceptions. I'm not seeing really small trees in these buildings. And really, there is only one main type of site that this represents, and that represents sites that are in valleys and areas that are places where people like to live, that are suitable for human habitation. But I would argue that these forests that are represented in these historic log buildings do offer us a snapshot in time of a different type of forest. So what do I mean by that? We dendrochronologists love old growth forests. We like hunting for them. We like the data that they give us. They're really important because they provide us long-term perspectives on ecological conditions, on climate, on human-environment relationships. The problem with old growth forests is they're really hard to find here in Eastern North America, and often they're in areas that are inaccessible to logging. So if we think about places where we can find old growth forests, a lot of them are located in dry, rocky, or steep slopes. Like the example that I'm showing here, this is the Humpty Dumpty site that's located on a talus slope in New York. And this is one of the more famous Eastern North America old growth forest sites. It's got really old Eastern hemlock and white pine. And these records here go back to, I think about 1600 for this particular place. The issue with our old growth forest sites, well, not really issue, something specific about them is that these trees are highly sensitive and highly stressed because of the locations that they're found in. So just to recap, our old growth forests are providing records for us that are from about 1500 to present. There are certainly some older old growth forests in small pockets and places in Eastern North America, but generally speaking, most of them go back to about 1500, 1600, something like that. And they really represent areas that are unsuitable for human occupation. If we compare that then with historic log buildings, which provide us tree ring records from about 1500 to 1900. So there's a lot of overlap between old growth forests and historic log building tree ring records, if you exclude the modern period. These provide us tree ring records from areas that are ideal for habitation and for agriculture. So I'm going to revisit this question again. What did the forests of Eastern North America look like prior to European colonization? My co-author and I conducted a study a few years ago, and we took log buildings, historic log buildings, and data from old growth forests, which are readily available on what's known as the International Tree Ring Data Bank, where we share our tree ring data with one another as dendrochronologists. So we had log buildings and we had old growth forests, and we wanted to compare them to see, are these really representative of different site types? So the first thing that we looked at was recruitment of trees. Now, this is not quite the same as germination of trees. Germination meaning like that first initial growth. Recruitment is a little bit more advanced. So we're talking about this transition from a seedling to a sapling or to a more mature tree. So when comparing recruitment of trees, what we found is that there was a shared recruitment pulse in both historic log buildings and in old growth forests that occurred starting in about the 1670s and continuing on through about 1730s. This is really interesting. This is something that both of these different site types had in common. What's really interesting about this is that European immigration into this particular area didn't occur until about 1740. So that can't be accounted for in European immigration. We certainly know that logging was something that happened quite a bit following immigration. The second thing that my co-author and I looked at was early growth strategy. So we wanted to see how are trees growing in their first 100 years of growth at these historic log building sites versus the old growth forest sites. So we used cluster analysis to assign early growth of all of these different trees and logs to different clusters. And what we found were two very different early growth strategies. We called the first one fast early growth, and the second one slow early growth. So if you compare these two figures, B and C, you can see that the fast early growth strategy is showing growth that starts at about 2 standardized mean ring width and exponentially, decreasing exponentially, and right around 80 years, it starts to level out. Whereas the slow early growth strategy starts at about 1.5, 1.6 standardized mean ring width, but it starts to level out more around like 20 years. So a very different look at their early growth strategies, how these trees were growing in their first 100 years. So we then looked to see what the breakdown of trees and sites was for this fast early growth strategy and for the slow early growth strategy. And what we found was that 61% of our historic log building sites fell within the fast early growth group, whereas 39% of our historic log building sites fell in the slow early growth group, and 100% of the old growth forests sites fell in the slow early growth group. So really interesting there. So we then took that a step further and we wanted to look at growth releases of trees. So what is a growth release? If you imagine a tree in a forest with a canopy above it of other trees, and one of those canopy dominant trees falls over, it creates an increase in light. The trees below it will respond to that increase in light by increasing their growth. And we can see this in the ring width patterns of trees. We see this as a growth release. So rings might be suppressed, and all of a sudden they're much larger for a certain period. And that indicates to us that there was some sort of disturbance that was occurring, a growth release. So we compared growth releases, based on the fast growth and slow growth groups that we identified using cluster analysis. So we had the fast historic group, we had the slow historic group because we did have historic sites in both fast growth and slow growth. And then we had the slow old growth group because only all of the old growth sites fell within the slow group. So we compared disturbances or growth releases for all of those. And what we found was that there was a significant difference in the number of growth releases between the historic sites that had fast early growth and between the old growth sites that had slow early growth. And that difference was 5.3 events per century versus 23.5 events per century. So really interesting there. So we're starting to see these differences between these sites, certainly. Old growth forest sites and historic sites do have some sort of difference between them. Just to sort of recap what I mentioned there, at the old growth sites, we found that there was a 1670s recruitment pulse. We also found that all of the old growth sites had slow early growth, and that they had frequent growth releases, which indicates that there is a canopy of trees above these trees as they're maturing into the forest. So groundbreaking research here, what we found was that the old growth sites acted as you would expect an old growth forest to act. Woo. Okay, but the part that was a little bit weird was the 1670s recruitment pulse. We were a little bit curious to know what was going on there. Then looking at the historic log building sites, we had that 1670s recruitment pulse. These trees had fast early growth, and they had very few growth releases, suggesting that there was not a canopy of trees above them. And so all of this information combined suggested to us that our historic log building sites were actually growing in second growth forests following forest succession. But the thing that really sort of nagged at us about the research was what was going on with this recruitment pulse that was consistent in both the historic log building sites and the old growth forest sites. What we actually is that this pulse in recruitment is consistent a lot across many sites. So I'm comparing here the Trouet et al. 2017 paper that shows a pulse of recruitment in 1660 and 1670 in Arkansas, Illinois, and Kentucky. And then Peterson et al. 2014 also found this recruitment pulse in a study that had tree ring data from across Eastern North America. So we have this large-scale recruitment pulse that's occurring in trees, and this is from living trees and historic buildings in all three studies that we're seeing this in. So what caused this mass recruitment of trees between 1660 and 1690? As we can tell, there are two potential explanations. The first is a subcontinental drought event. So Peterson et al., looked into this quite a bit because of the recruitment pulse that they saw. And what they found was that there was a major drought event that occurred on the subcontinental scale, and this created forest thinning, or caused forest thinning rather. It was followed by a pluvial or a wetting event, which then allowed for the subsequent establishment of trees to regrow in this forest. So this is the explanation that they were able to provide for this. And if we look at this figure here, it's showing Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is just a way of measuring drought. And we can see that across several different sites representing sub-regional scale places, that there is a drought event that's occurring there, and it is followed by a pluvial. The problem with that is that this particular explanation doesn't explain the differences that I saw and that my co-authors saw in the growth between our sites. So why we saw fast early growth at our historic sites and why we saw fewer growth releases compared to the old growth forest. It certainly explains why there might be a large scale recruitment event, but it doesn't address those differences. So just to recap those there, that we had 61% of sites that had fast early growth and far fewer growth releases than old growth forests. So we did a little bit of research into this, and what we found was that there is a lovely varved lake near our study site, actually within our study site, which provides a 1,000-year-long record of sediment charcoal. So with pretty good decadal resolution on this record, annual resolution on this record. And we can see on this record 1,000 years of fire activity on the landscape is what this is representing. And you can see these highs and lows, so peaks in fire activity, and lulls in fire activity. But what stood out the most to my co-author and I was between the periods 1650 and 1680, there was no fire in this record. It was just completely gone, completely absent. And this is prior to the historic period when European immigrants had moved into this particular area. So right around this time, a paper came out in Quaternary Science Reviews by Koch et al. This is in 2019. They had this really interesting study that came up that got a lot of publicity, including the New York Times. But what these authors did is they used a multi-proxy approach to demonstrate that humans altered global climate long before the Industrial Revolution. So the authors of this paper estimated that there were about 65 million people living in the Americas prior to European contact. And then following European contact and colonization and the epidemics that were brought about 55 million people died. And this mass depopulation event led to the abandonment of extensively managed lands. And over time, forests began to regrow on these cleared lands. And this regrowth of forests was so extensive that it actually increased biomass and increased carbon drawdown, which then decreased temperature and ultimately led to the coldest portion of the Little Ice Age. So this is a really fascinating study, but the problem with this particular study is that the authors didn't have empirical evidence of forest regrowth, which was central to their hypothesis using this extensive forest regrowth model. So this led me and my co-author to wonder if historic log buildings might provide this evidence. So just as a reminder, early European immigrants built their homes on fertile, flat upland valleys near water sources. And these are the same site types that were preferred by the indigenous peoples that lived in this area prior to European immigration. So historic log buildings then might be a suitable record for looking at past forest conditions. If we look at the timing of depopulation of indigenous peoples in Eastern North America, and this word, by the way, is used sort of broadly, this has a lot of different meanings. This isn't just mortality, this is movement. There's a lot of different ways that we can think about depopulation, but I'm going to use this word here just in the sense of people not being in a certain area at a certain time. But the timing of depopulation is not something that happened all at once in Eastern North America. This is something that happened in phases with the push of European colonization, with people moving into the area. But for my particular study region, this happened between about 1629 to 1677. And so I'm going to provide the alternative solution to why we might have seen this recruitment of trees, and that is the cessation of indigenous land management in my study region. So there are several lines of evidence to support this idea. The first was the modeled effects of biomass increase from the Koch et al. Paper. The second is the estimated timing of indigenous depopulation between 1629 and 1677. The third is the evidence of fire cessation between 1650 and 1670. The fourth is the recruitment pulse that I saw in my historic log building data beginning in the 1670s and prior to European occupation of this area, which didn't begin until about 1740, and that's pretty early. 1760 is a little more appropriate there. The fifth is the fact that I saw this fast early growth and these growth release frequency differences between the historic log buildings and old growth forests, which really suggests that historic logs were felled from second growth forests. And then finally, there's historical documentation of land abandonment and forest regrowth in about the 1650s to 1660s. So this is a quote from a European immigrant traveler moving through my study area, right through one of my sites. And this person, this is in the 1750s and 1760s, said that they saw remnants of fields and stands of trees uniform in growth, about 100 years old, some of which were growing up through the cobblestone floors. And I'm highlighting about 100 years old there because if we do the math, that means those trees would have started growing right around the 1650s to 1660s, which also coincides with the timing of other events presented in the evidence of the last slide. So again, this question of, what did European colonizers see when they came to North America? Was it the primeval forest, or was it a legacy of land management? The results from the study that I conducted with my co-author suggest that European immigrants actually encountered second growth forests in upland areas following colonization and subsequent depopulation and forced land abandonment of indigenous peoples in this area. I want to go back to this idea of the enduring romanticism of the primeval forest. And this is part 3, Schrodinger's forest. If I show you this picture that was done by an artist in 2016, in 2016, foggy winter West Virginia forest. If I show you this picture, does it make you think that nobody lives in West Virginia? Or what about these photos of this person hugging these large trees? When you see a picture like that, does it make you think that there are only big trees in North America? I would argue that small trees just don't have the same effect. We don't see people hugging small trees, although we occasionally do see pictures of people with small trees. I also want to revisit these pictures that I showed you before from Tumult on the Mountains, these white oak massive trees. There was a study that was done in 2016 by Thomas Van Gundy and Wetzel, and they did a deep dive into these photos because something about them just didn't sit right with them. And these are both foresters, or at least one of them is a forester in West Virginia, very well known. But these pictures sort of nagged at Van Gundy. And what they found was that the sources of these photos are from Humboldt State University in California. And that these massive white oak trees, that if you Google big trees in West Virginia, they're the first ones that pop up. They're actually coastal redwood. They're not white oak trees. They're not from West Virginia. So to revisit the idea of the enduring romanticism of the primeval forest, it's really problematic in many ways. It actually suggests that prior to European colonization, Indigenous peoples of Eastern North America were either A, passive players on the landscape who didn't have an impact, or worse, B, too few in numbers to even have an impact. And we know that this is not true. We have archaeological evidence to show otherwise, that North America was highly populated. So A here, this figure is showing us Cahokia, which around the time of 1200, I think was about the size of London, if not larger. And B, we have the digital index of North American archaeology. Every pixel in this picture is an archaeological site. And if you go to their website, they say that the vast majority of these sites are Indigenous sites. So why do people keep perpetuating the myth of the primeval forest? A friend of mine is actually the one who suggested that this is sort of like Schrodinger's forest, because we have these two disparate depictions of pre-colonial America. And which one is right? So I'll let you sort of sit on that and think about why we might have this ongoing idea of the vast untamed wilderness versus what archaeological evidence suggests to us. And I want to give you very quickly a sneak peek into some new research that I'm working on. I'm expanding my study area using historic log buildings for ecological purposes. We're also talking about climate here, but this is a paper that I'm working on with Dr. Rockner, who many of you all met, and a few other co-authors. Our study region is Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. And we are incorporating 99 live tree sites, not necessarily old growth, and 41 new historic timber sites that we've been collecting data from, historic log building sites. And one of the things we wanted to know is going back to this idea of, are old growth forests and historic timbers forests, do they represent different site types? So we asked the question, do live trees, which I'll show you here in green, and historic timbers, the historic log buildings, which are shown in brown, do they respond differently to extreme climate events if we're assuming that they're from different locations? And so here's what we found. We compared 3 different major extreme climatic events. The first was the year 1774, which is a late season frost event that affected a lot of trees. The second is the year without a summer, 1816. This is following the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora. And then finally, 1839, which was a severe drought that occurred in Eastern North America. And what we found is that there was no difference in the response between live trees and historic timbers from buildings in response to the 1774 frost event. So they responded pretty similarly. Then comparing the year without a summer, so the following of the volcanic eruption event, what we found was, again, no real difference. However, I would say that there's something interesting going on in the years following that. So we sort of have showing you the 5 years before and the 5 years after the event. So there may be some sort of lag effect there on how these trees are responding to that eruption or to the year without a summer. What was most interesting is that we actually see, when comparing drought events, that our historic timber sites, so our historic log buildings, have a more extreme response to the severe drought event than did the live tree sites. And this is so hot off the press that I don't have more information to share for you about it, except for to say that we are seeing some pretty interesting differences, and you'll have to hang tight to see what else we find in our research. So before I end, I do want to acknowledge the funding agencies that helped me conduct the research that I did. I ultimately worked on about 50 or so historic log buildings, and I was able to do that without charging any sort of fee to the owners of those buildings, many of whom would not otherwise be able to know how old their buildings were. They wouldn't be able to pay that sort of cost. And so the West Virginia Humanities Council was really pivotal to doing this research, as well as a few fellowships that I had with West Virginia University at the time and a Virginia Humanities grant. But with that, I think I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone might have.